to Jews on Film. I'm Daniel Zana.
Hey, I'm Harry Adensasser.
Welcome, everyone who's listening. You've made it this far, about three seconds in.
Thanks to all our devoted fans.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a podcast where we are going to be taking a look at films and just analyzing and talking about them in terms of, their Jewishness, whether they are explicitly Jewish or not so explicitly Jewish, and talk about the making of the films, the people in front of and behind the camera, talk about the plot of the films, the contents of the films, and the themes of the films, and chat about their Jewishness.
Yeah, we are both Jewish. We both love movies. So this is going to be a cool way to just sort of explore some of the movies that might be, explicitly Jewish, that you'd watch that and say, oh, that's obviously a Jewish film, or even find some of the Jewish aspects of, some other films where you might not expect it.
Why would someone trust you, Harry? What are your qualifications for this podcast?
Yeah, the one technical thing I could sort of put to that is I was a film major in college, which hasn't helped me in so many avenues of life. But at least here, I would say this gives me a little bit of the requisite expertise that maybe I need to, that justifies this podcast sort of for myself. But no, it's really, as I was saying before, I'm Jewish. I love movies. I love talking about movies. I love thinking about how they resonate with myself and, a broader audience. And, I've definitely made it a little bit of a passion of mine trying to figure out, which movies I can connect to and which movies, might represent some versions of what I see in myself on screen. And I think, when you asked me about joining you on this podcast and talking about some of the stuff a little bit, I was excited to just explore, what that means for a movie to be Jewish.
Yeah. You seem like a pretty qualified person. Someone gave you a degree that said that you are, according to your university, you are able to critique films in a way that some others can't. So, and I myself am a video editor and studied film. And, as Harry said, we're both Jewish and passionate about film. And really, for me, I've been just looking for an avenue to express myself in the podcast form and be able to talk about things that I like and things that I watch and consume and see movies that I normally wouldn't see, which is not the case in this film today, but there are a lot of films out there and there's more every day. I feel like with all the streaming platforms, there's so much to watch, and having an excuse to watch these movies is certainly a exciting thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, no question. Before
we dive into today's movie, what was your background like growing up with what Jewish film meant? Like, what does that mean to you? Or what did that mean to you growing up?
I would say to one end, any explicitly sort of Jewish movie, was what I would thought was almost the extent of Jewish movies. If it was about, Jews doing a very specifically Jewish thing. And often it was the case that the movies that I'm thinking of were the ones shown to me in, yeshiva day school, where it was a movie specifically about, the holiday of Passover. And we were just sort of like, oh, that was a Jewish movie. And then in my own, free time, I watch other sort of explicitly Jewish movies. And I will say one of the things that I was really drawn to in lieu of, what I conceived of as being, a large amount of popular Jewish movies was I felt very drawn to, other religious movies. So often was the case. There are many, Catholic films. People talk about, Martin Scorsese as being someone drawn to portraying Catholic guilt on screen. And I can think of movies like Silence, which, he put out a couple of years ago, which I loved. And it was about sort of this religious struggle for these characters. And that sort of was what I thought of as being a religious movie for me. I wasn't going to find the equivalent, let's say, in a Jewish movie, just because I wasn't, looking, it wasn't, shown to me so much in a way that I could think of. But I remember seeing that and thinking, okay, I can just make my own connection to these other religious films. So I would say for the most part, it was, either it was explicitly Jewish or, I would make my sort of back end connection through, an otherwise Christian movie.
Right.
But yeah.
Nice. And for myself, I would say there were, movies like the Ten Commandments.
Right.
I remember my dad had I feel like we had Columbia House where you would buy a bunch of VHS tapes or something like that. And then, so we had the double VHS 10 Commandments. And then we actually went to the library once, and Charlton Heston was doing some sort of book reading, and we got it signed by Charlton Heston. So that's a memory that's etched in my brain. So that was like a big Jewish movie. And then also I feel like there's like other ones that I saw in school, like the animated Haggadah. For those who don't know, it's like a, I want to say it's like an early 90s, like stop motion claymation story retelling of the Passover story. And so there's a companion actual Haggadah, which is like the book that we read on Passover. So those are some ones that stick out like at the top of my mind that were like explicitly Jewish. But, as we'll talk about today with our movie, there are other ones that were like Jewish, not over the head kind of Jewy, but had a lot of Jewish themes and you could definitely tell. So why don't we dive into it? Let's take a quick break and we'll get into our movie today. All right. And we're back. We are here today to talk about Blazing Saddles, directed by the great Mel Brooks. Harry, what is your experience with Blazing Saddles? Had you seen it before this podcast?
One time I had seen it. I must have been, I don't know, younger than 13. Let's call it like 10, 11, 12 years old. And I remember watching it at my friend's house. And I remember it was very funny at the time. I can't say I understood everything that was going on. I definitely remember my friend's dad, shutting the sort of screen standing in front of the TV screen and blocking out, certain things that, maybe some language that I think he didn't think was appropriate for his son and his friends. But I kind of watched it then and then hadn't really revisited it until we watched it for the podcast. I had seen some other Mel Brooks films and obviously was very familiar with it, but I hadn't really sat down to watch the whole thing until I did before we recorded today. How about you?
So I saw the movie a while ago and I've seen it maybe a couple times over the years. But I feel like for me, the Mel Brooks movie that stuck out the most and the one that I most identified with was like Spaceballs, because I was like a Star Wars fan. I still am to some extent, less now with all the special editions and all that jazz. But like, I'm still a Star Wars person. There was less social commentary in Spaceballs. I feel like it was very much, if you knew Star Wars, then you got Spaceballs. Whereas like Blazing Saddles, as a young kid, there's a bit of context you need to understand, like what is a Western and, race relations. Maybe as a kid, you're just not as attuned to all that stuff. I do remember some of the jokes, even as a young kid, and like, and so yeah, it stuck out to me. But then watching it, like you said, for the podcast with a specific lens in mind of looking at it as an adult in 2021. You kind of take it in a different way. All right. So Harry, why don't you break it down for us and tell us a little bit about what the movie's about?
Yeah, sure. So the basic plot is about this politician, Hedley Lamar, and he basically becomes interested in buying this land where a new railroad track is being built, sort of very Western theme. And in order to acquire it, he basically, he wants to purchase the land, but unfortunately there's a town in the way. So he hatches the scheme after, a number of different plans fail to render the town unlivable so that all of its inhabitants leave and he can just sort of take the land for himself. So after going through a number of different plans, he ultimately decides, after the sheriff is killed, to appoint Bart, the character of Bart, who's played by Cleavon Little, to be a sort of black sheriff in the town. And, given this is a very racist town and the movie plays up that, a tremendous amount, his hope is that his appointing of the character of Bart will draw everyone to evacuate the town. But, as time goes on, they sort of rally behind their sheriff and fight back. And in the meantime, Bart strikes up a strong relationship with Gene Wilder's character of Jim,
aka the Waco Kid, who used to have the fastest hands in the West. I love that gag where he's shaking his hand like this, and he goes, "No." He says, "Your hand's not shaking at all." He shows his right hand, and then on the left hand, he's like, "No, I shoot with this hand."
Exactly. Definitely playing off a trope there, a Western trope of the sort of retired, quick shooter, but doesn't seem to take him very long to sort of recover his speed in the movie as soon as they need it.
Yeah. I mean, this movie is packed with jokes. Like there are so many jokes in this movie and it is so well written in terms of that aspect. Like it's so packed and it's like one of these things where it's a blink and you miss it kind of thing. That jokes will just kind of keep going. And there's like big jokes that they go for. And like, the movie makes sure that you acknowledge those jokes, but then there's also these little asides that they have with each other that, yeah, if you didn't catch it, if you didn't hear it, if you turn around for a second, you're going to miss a joke, but there's a lot in there and it's really densely packed. So yeah, it's interesting. I watched this behind the scenes documentary called Back in the Saddle. We'll put the link to that in the show notes. But one of the interesting things that I sort of read about both from Wikipedia and watching the documentary is that the way that the movie came about, one of the things that's worth noting is that Richard Pryor, famous comedian, wrote on the movie and was initially considered to play the Cleavon Little role. In addition, another piece of fun trivia is that John Wayne was actually considered for the Gene Wilder role of the Waco Kid, but Gene Wilder kind of came in last minute when they had some casting issues, which I think would have been a very different movie if you had John Wayne and Richard Pryor in Blazing Saddles.
Totally. It's tough to think of John Wayne being self-deprecating enough for the role, just given his persona and some of the other movies that he's been in.
Yeah, absolutely.
It would have made for an interesting movie.
And it seemed like Mel Brooks had a really hard time getting the film made because this was made in 1974 and things were very different then in terms of what you could and couldn't say. And the fact that he was able to, at the end, come out with this movie, which is still, he said this in a number of interviews that like, he wouldn't be able to get this movie made today. What do you think about that? You think that's true? Yeah.
I mean, I definitely think that sort of with, 2021 ears sort of listening to some of just the use of the N-word specifically in this movie. And, obviously it's spoken, I think you mentioned to me before the show, it's specifically put in the mouths of, the characters that are supposed to be, the villains of the movie. And, we don't see any of the sympathetic characters necessarily using it. And it was interesting before that you mentioned Richard Pryor, because I also did read that, he was part of the sort of decision process going into using, the N-word so liberally. And I think, Mel Brooks actually mentioned in an interview that he had sort of been given the green light to sort of use it as he did in the movie by, Richard Pryor and some of the other, contemporary comedians of the time. So it's definitely, I think it's a choice that's necessary for this movie. I think it creates this sort of jarring tone that, works for some of the comedy and the ridiculousness of that side and of those characters. But no question, it's jarring to hear it, in a movie that I think couldn't have been made for the last, 10 years at least.
The villains in the movie definitely use it a lot, but then you have, to show a sort of turn in the movie, you have an old lady who is confronted by Sheriff Bart. She runs into him in the town and she says something like, "Get away from me, you dirty N-word," or something like that.
Good morning, ma'am. And isn't it a lovely morning? Up yours.
Yeah. But then later in the film, the same old lady who calls him the N-word earlier makes him a pie and comes around, does a full 180.
Good evening, Sheriff. Sorry about the up yours. I hope this apple pie will in some small way say thank you for your ingenuity and courage in defeating that horrible Mongol. So I think,
the use of that word is showing, it kind of represents evil and sort of, I think that throughout the movie, there's quite a bit of racism, but it's primarily a tool used by the villains in the movie, whether that's the Chinese people building the railroads at the beginning or the black people at the beginning, building the railroad as well and singing, chain gang songs and things like that. And then having the bad guys make fun of them, that kind of thing. It's kind of like a live wire of a movie. Like it's a third rail, if you will, or something like that. It's pretty, it gets to it, but it also has this sort of veneer, of comedy on the outside of the movie to kind of get to the heart of it, which is kind of, racism, I would say. But the way that they package it in this sort of slapstick, goofy comedy with so many different set pieces and which we'll talk about, but the way that he's able to do it, I feel like I don't know, in other Mel Brooks movies that I've seen that are so sort of, I don't want to say politically charged, but maybe socially charged, Yeah. Do you want to get into the Jewish aspects of it and sort of, it seems so Mel Brooks, who made the movie, who directed the movie, Jewish, Gene Wilder, Jewish, a number of the cast people, the Madeline Kahn, who plays Lili Von Shtup. She is Jewish. So if we're talking clearly or specifically just about the people behind the scenes, Mel Brooks's mistress, Miss Stein, kind of sounds Jewish. We have Norman Steinberg, Andrew Bergman, who are the screenwriters. So behind the scenes and to some extent, in front of the camera, there are some Jewish people. Anything in its production that rings Jewish to you?
Yeah, I think, in our conversation about sort of what makes a movie Jewish and how we're going to sort of assess that, I think it's undeniable when, the casting crew and specifically, sort of the production team is coming from or writing from this Jewish perspective, that's necessarily imbued. And I don't think that's true for every screenwriter, director, filmmaker in Hollywood, but with Mel Brooks, that's certainly the case. We were talking about Spaceballs before, and when they're sort of mocking the Force, they call it the Schwartz. And there's a Jewishness almost inherent to his movies, and not only by virtue of him being Jewish, but certainly he works his Jewishness into the films. And I know we both pointed out plenty of examples where that shows up, but I think you're right. Assembling this cast, working with Jewish writers, that gives it a leg up in terms of it becoming a Jewish movie, which I think we'd both agree it ultimately definitely is, in addition to its, politics and its play on the Western.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's interesting, right? So if we think about the content of the film, it's a Western, which is not traditionally a Jewish genre. I would say like a companion movie that I've yet to watch, and maybe we could do that for like a bonus episode, is The Frisco Kid, starring Harrison Ford and Gene Wilder. But traditionally the Western is not really a Jewish genre. It's mostly like cowboys versus Native Americans. And, the two are, it's neither are Jewish. And so to introduce the Jewish element into this film is an interesting choice. I wouldn't say necessarily that the plot is, I can't speak for non-Jewish viewers, but as someone who didn't have that lens kind of going into the movie, I wonder what that experience would look like if it would just ring true as like a funny movie, and that you wouldn't need so much context to get the basic premise of the movie. There's plenty of jokes in the movie that play whether or not you understand Yiddish. Like there's a scene in the movie where a flashback from Bart's childhood where he runs into Mel Brooks, who is in native faith, if you want to call it that. And he's speaking Yiddish.
No, seid nicht meshuggah. Los im Gain! Kappa walk. It's all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be gesund. Take off.
I feel like that would still play if you don't understand Yiddish. It's just a funny guy, doing a sort of stereotypical Yiddish accent.
I was going to say definitely recognizable Yiddish.
Yes.
Even if you didn't understand it.
Sure. And I feel like at this point, like Mel Brooks's voice is very much, people associate that with like a stereotypical kind of Jewish voice.
Yeah. I want to agree with you there, because I do think that the movie definitely isn't only, I think the Jewish lens isn't the first lens that this movie's taking. It's a Western by way of this, sort of social commentary. And I think the Jewishness definitely accents it a little bit. I think it's something that if you're, like us, who's watching it through that lens, I think you can appreciate that a lot of the gags of this movie are Jewish, but they're not necessarily driving, the movie itself and its themes. I do think that this movie plays with a sort of Jewish humor sensibility, I think, and part of that is driven because, my definition and a lot of people's definition for a Jewish sensibility comes from comedians like Mel Brooks. So I think that, his sense of humor and the way that he delivers these jokes and the flipping into the Yiddish. And I think there's a number of examples we could pull from the movie, give it a sort of Jewish sensibility that I think is one of the main through lines of the movie. I think it's, the Western with the social commentary and this Jewish sensibility. But I agree with you that if you don't have that Jewish lens, you're not necessarily missing out on not only the plot of the movie, but even most of the jokes.
Oh yeah, totally. And some of the jokes, we're talking, every time somebody hits their head, they say, oi, everything. There's plenty of Nazis to go around in the movie, which is, kind of like ludicrous, but, it's very like Jewish, like Mel Brooks is very much, and I would say that almost like Taika Waititi is his like next of, like his next generation, who's also really obsessed with Hitler in the sense that he made like Jojo Rabbit and played Hitler, which I think Mel Brooks also played Hitler in one of his movies in like a flashback. I would say maybe in correct me if I'm wrong, but like I feel like in History of the World Part 1, like in one of the Jews in Space or something, or Hitler on Ice, maybe he played him. I forget.
I think you might be right.
But they're talking about, the bad guys are talking about their plans.
I know how we can run everybody out of Rock Ridge.
How?
We'll kill the firstborn male child in every household.
Too Jewish.
The characters in the movie are already referencing the idea of something being too Jewish. So it's like very much kind of like a wink, to those who are watching who know. But like we said, if you're not Jewish or you're not as familiar with a lot of the Jewish references, you would still think the movie is funny. Content wise, I would say it's like you said, it's a Western with a dash of social commentary, with a dash of like Judaism, like a pinch of Judaism or Jewishness, I would say, not Judaism. Judaism is the religion. I would say like Jewishness is like more cultural, maybe that's what I'll call it. But yeah, are there any like thematic Jewish values, themes, or ideas that kind of stick out to you?
It was interesting when you were talking about the Frisco Kid, because that, the Waco Kid, Gene Wilder's character is, obviously sort of an allusion to that, to that same character. It's just a very similar, background. And, I was thinking about the sort of, lone figure with, trying to like convert these people. And I'm not sure, who like, because that's its own trope, this sort of, great savior. I mean, it's not quite, the white savior. It's honestly a full inversion of that. But
sure.
But it did feel very sort of like prophetic to me, almost like a prophet. I do think that there is a little bit of a prophetic tone to this sort of character and to the almost biblical nature of the story. And, cut me off if I'm getting, if this is all too much of a stretch, because obviously, this is us imposing a little bit of a view, and this could just be, because it's also, this is a very Western story, sort of the lone gunslinger or the new sheriff kind of like converting a wild town to sort of be more civilized. And I know that that's, very inherent to the Western genre.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, what sort of Jewish and, like I was saying, sort of prophetic characters, might, or just themes might work into that. And I think trying to read a sort of Jewish or a biblical lens into this, in most Westerns would probably be, uncalled for. But, because we know, because of obviously Mel Brooks, and because of that reference, we can't do a punishment that's too Jewish. It definitely is flirting with a lot of these Jewish themes.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I don't know if we mentioned yet, but, spoiler alert, everything kind of works out for the good guys at the end of the movie. And it ends with this like beautiful fight all over the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank. And then we go to the Hollywood Man's Chinese Theater. But before that, I feel like the part with the resolving the conflict around them building building a railroad through the town. One of these big speeches that Sheriff Bart gives is that he brings together, the white town folk, the Chinese railroad workers, and the black railroad workers in a way of like, like togetherness. Achdut is the word in Hebrew, but like treating others like you want to be treated. And so like what Sheriff Bart is doing is he's bringing others together and treating, he's wanting to make sure that everyone's getting treated the same.
Who the hell are they? Railroad workers. They've agreed to help us make our dream come true. And all they ask in return is a little plot of land they can call their own, the homestead. Now, what do you say?
All right, we'll give some land to the and the but we don't want the Irish.
Everybody. No deal.
Oh, prairie shit. Everybody.
I guess everyone's just a little bit racist at heart, is what he's trying to say with that.
Absolutely.
I thought that was like, oh, great. We resolved the whole thing and everybody loves each other. But no, definitely not.
even when you were talking about that scene and, someone might play back this podcast and you might have some of the more grounded theories. And, I think I'm coming in with another stretch, but, just if you're familiar sort of with the story of, the Jewish people, when they come down to Egypt, Jacob and his sons, and they're sort of given their own, plot of land in the sort of town of Goshen, that's sort of apart from the rest of Egypt, but still kind of connected to it. And that seems to me very reminiscent of the resolution of just sort of, for these, these black workers that are building the train, they're sort of given this sort of plot in the land. No one's saying that the town has to become fully integrated, but it's, if they help you, can you at least give them space to live on their own? Right. Because that's sort of what they're given, as reward for helping out, and just, alongside this whole narrative of, like kind of this leader coming down into Egypt and working for his people. And Egypt is my introduction. That's not obviously where this film is set, but again, maybe a little bit of a stretch. I don't think that the movie Jewishness predicates on this theory, but could have been, why not? There's been a lot of Jews in deserts. So totally. I would say, we are jumping to the end, but I feel like just to go back into the middle, kind of to more of the goofy stuff, I feel like there's, the introduction of Lili Von Shtup, who's I guess part of the plan is to, whatever they try everything. Hedley Lamar, played by Harvey Korman, and his right-hand man Taggart, played by Slim Pickens, they are trying their best to get Cleavon Little, after he's accepted by the town. They try something else. So they introduce him to Lili Von Shtup, who then is taken completely by Cleavon Little. And she offers him Schnitzengruben, and he has like 17 sauerkrauts and hot dogs and whatever. But she has a great number. And she plays, she sings, "I'm So Tired." That's her sort of song that she sings. And it's done in a very sort of like Jewish way, where it's not this like sexy sort of like song where she's, talking about her assets or whatever. She's just kind of like the word is kvetching, right? So she's just kind of like whining about as a woman of the night, she is just so tired of it all. And so one thing I discovered after looking up this doc that I mentioned earlier, Back in the Saddle, is that this is actually it's an homage to this Marlene Dietrich song called "The Laziest Gal in Town." So maybe I'll just play a little bit of that for you.
It's simply because I'm the laziest gal in town. Nothing ever worries me. No one ever hurries me. I take pleasure leisurely, even when I kiss.
And now, for comparison, if you want to, you're interested to hear the side by side, we can take a listen to that.
Here I stand, the goddess of desire, set men on fire. I have this power. Morning, noon, and night, it's drink and dancing, some quick romancing, and then a shower. Stage door Johnnies constantly surround me. They always hound me with one request. Who can satisfy their lustful habit? I'm not a rabbit. I need some rest. I'm tired, sick and tired of love. I've had my fill of love.
Not the most seductive song you want to hear, but that's Mel Brooks for you,
Yeah. I mean, I think this whole character is clearly something that, she definitely came out in the movie to me as being a sort of more overtly Jewish, insertion into the movie. And I hadn't heard that original version until you played it for me before we started recording, but I was shocked to hear how, the sort of German accent that was already in the film, because I thought that was fully conjured up by Mel Brooks. But I mean, he clearly introduces a lisp and this sort of Yiddish intonation. And like you were saying, this sort of kvetching. I mean, I would be remiss not to point out that her name Von Shtup, Shtup obviously is the Yiddish word for, having sex. So It's very clearly this sort of Yiddish take on this sort of seductive character. And yeah, I think it's all clearly there.
She's great. She's taken by Sheriff Bart. And, I would say throughout the film, we've got it all. We have dick jokes. We have fart jokes. We have cartoonish violence. I mean, to the point, like later in the film where Sheriff Bart delivers a candygram.
Candygram for Mongo. Candygram for Mongo.
Hey, Mongo.
Sign, please. Thank you.
Mongo like candy.
So then again, it's like this sort of, there's so many jokes in there, and there's, it's, I think it's just great the way that he's able to like sneak in like subtle social commentary, that it works on so many levels. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I think the movie is sort of a reverence for even its own, parody, because even as much as this is a parody of the Western genre, I mean, it breaks that mold so many times, before we even get to that huge ending that just sort of fully leaves the movie itself. But, even with all these like jokes and some of the humor that fully pulls you out of the world. I mean, one of my favorites is when they're talking about Hedley Lamar, the character. And, obviously there's the famous actress Hedy Lamarr. And, there's a great joke where they say his name, I think. And then Mel Brooks's character goes like, oh, what? This is the 1800s. She won't be able to she's going to be the one to have to sue you, sort of pulling us out of the movie and pretending like this, he's the character that sort of came first, which I think famously she did try to sue the movie or something. Oh,
did she? Okay.
I think there was something like that happened that they kind of just settled. But yeah, it's just that the movie is just so, irreverent and so out, like as much as it's about, this sort of Western parody, it really is just about throwing in all this humor and throwing in all these different, disparate references. And I agree with you. I think some of these jokes, that Looney Tunes reference, he just works them all in there.
And I feel like, it's worth mentioning every time someone calls him Hetty, he always goes, "It's Hedley." And
Exactly.
that's just like a running gag they reference. One of the, there's a few famous lines, so they're recruiting at the end of the film, sort of like the third act of the film. They recruit all sorts of bad guys for the film. And so they have Klansmen, bikers. They have Mel Brooks as a cameo, as a director. And then there's that famous line.
Be ready to attack Rock Ridge at noon tomorrow. Here's your badge.
Badges? We don't need no stinking badges. Oh, no.
There's like so many, there's just like so many good gags, and the fact that they're like so self-referential and they're referential about the genre, things like that. It's it's pretty hilarious.
Yep.
And every time that the movie progresses and you think it's getting like too serious, they have these like just like ridiculous and ludicrous scenes to make you remember that it is a Mel Brooks movie and not to take it too seriously. Towards the end of the movie, they like we said before, they set up a fake city as a decoy, and the crooks come through. They go to the fake city, they attack it, and then they get ambushed by our good guys, and the fight carries on from the Western area through the back stages of Warner Brothers Studios. And then we are we get like a really nice tour of Warner Brothers. We go to a musical with a lot of dancers and things like that. And then it goes to the commissary. We have some cameos as well. And so it's like a fun sort of way to end the movie, because, sort of once the conflict has been resolved, like, where do you go from there? It's kind of, it's a lot, but you do see Hitler kind of eating lunch with someone else. And then they have like a big fight. And why don't you tell us what happens next?
And then they have that fight. And I think at some point basically the character of Hedley Lamar's character, tries to escape, and he runs off into the sort of Chinese theater, the famous Chinese theater in Los Angeles. And he goes into a screening of the movie. And as he's sort of watching the movie, and this wouldn't be the first time that Mel Brooks did this sort of gag of watching the movie in the movie, as he does it again in Spaceballs. But as he's watching the movie, he sees Sheriff Bart's character sort of coming to the theater, from behind him, and, knowing he's been found out, he sort of runs outside, and they have their final stand together.
Yeah. It's kind of a great way to end it. You did forget to mention he hails a yellow cab. So Sheriff Bart chases after the yellow cab on horse.
On horse. Exactly.
Yeah, but it's great. And, overall, why don't we get to our ratings? So I think one way we could go about rating these movies, 1 out of 5 Jewish stars, obviously Jewish podcast, I guess we could just talk about the production value, in front of and behind the camera. How Jewish is it? The content, how Jewish is that? The themes, and then maybe overall Jewishness. Or we could just go overall Jewishness. I don't know.
Yeah. I like the way of going through the categories, maybe working our way towards, overall Jewishness by breaking it down. So, I think we should start with the background. I know we've mentioned, a lot of this, but obviously, Mel Brooks is Jewish and, very Jewish in his filmmaking, along with, some of the actors. You mentioned Gene Wilder, the writers, were Jewish. So clearly, I think this would be the case of a movie that has, Jewish production to it. In that sense, it certainly is a Jewish movie.
So I would say like the Jewish production, 1 out of 5 stars, I would say there are Jewish elements to it. So I'd say like maybe 2.5, 3 stars. I don't know. I mean, the majority of the cast is not Jewish, right? But behind the scenes, definitely Jewish. So I'd say like, I don't know, I'm going to give it like 2.5, 3 stars, something like that.
Yeah. I think I would agree with you, 3.5. I think, there are Jewish filmmakers, and then I think there's Mel Brooks. And I think, by virtue of him being the director here, I think that makes it a little bit more, Jewish necessarily than someone, who you might sort of look up a movie and say, oh, this person, his parents happen to be Jewish. I guess he was Jewish. So
right.
I think any movie that Mel Brooks, makes, including this one, and then anything he would make after that, I think just by virtue of him, being the director, I think in some ways that makes it a Jewish movie. And you could argue that that's more a function of the content that he actually inserts into the film. But I do think that he films with this sort of Jewish lens, this Jewish perspective that, I think justifies us calling this a little bit more of a Jewish, made movie.
What about the content? I mean, for me, I would say I'm going to be like the pessimist here. I would say it's not really like a Jewish film, right? For me, it has Jewish elements and it has Jewish jokes, and there are Jewish, subtle or not so subtle nods. It's a Western movie with social commentary, but it doesn't set out to be a Jewish film. It sets out to be like a funny Western, and it succeeds in that for sure. But like we said before, you don't need that sort of, Jewish context to appreciate the film. Any joke that they're making and they're speaking in Yiddish, the way that the context around how they're making the joke is heavily implied. So you'll get it even though you don't speak Yiddish. I'm fairly certain that as a young kid who didn't speak Yiddish growing up, I got most of those jokes. So yeah, I would say again, like kind of middle of the road, like I get 2.5, 3 stars. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. What about yourself?
Yeah, I want to jump on that point you were making about, because I know we did discuss that, if you don't have the Jewish context or the Jewish background or the Jewish lens, you will still appreciate this movie. And I absolutely agree with that. But I do wonder if it's the same movie without it. I think that there are movies that, the Jewish elements are more pronounced than they were in this movie. But I definitely think that it wasn't just one throwaway joke. It was multiple references to Hitler, which obviously he is not only relevant from a Jewish framework, but certainly, in a movie that has absolutely nothing to do with him, his repeated inclusion definitely to me suggests a little bit of a Jewish lens. I think, the Yiddish, like you mentioned, in context, it does, it is possible to get past it. But, knowing recognizing it, I think I noticed when it shows up, throughout, like, that Lili Von Shtup character, all the oys that are thrown in, all these characters later, I do think that some of this Jewish stuff really does pervade the movie deeper than just, a mere accent that might, that I do think colors it. I think as this movie is a Western first and foremost, a parody, a Western, I think it offers some social commentary, but I do think that Jewishness is a component of this film, in the way that I think we're going to have to stretch it into some other films later on in the life of this podcast. So okay. I also, same with the other answer. I think I would lean towards 3.5 out of 5 stars for how Jewish it is.
Great. Yeah. That's what this is all about. Disagreeing, when you don't always have to see eye to eye about this.
No, totally. Yeah. What's more Jewish than that?
Exactly. Friendly disagreement or not so friendly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Jewish themes, I would say, like the message that leaves you with for me, I feel like this kind of, at least on my end, like scores a little bit higher in terms of values, maybe not so much like, they don't talk about Rosh Hashanah or Passover or whatever, that kind of thing. But I do feel like the value of kind of like inclusion and treating everyone kindly, while not like a specifically like Jewish value, there are pieces to, and maybe it could be said nowadays that like most people are about bringing people together and treating others like you want to be treated. That's the golden rule, right? And so that certainly has Jewish roots and whatnot. So I would say I would probably give this one like a 4 out of 5. Yeah, see, I can be positive sometimes.
No, I'm happy you are, because I think I'm about to be a little bit more negative, which is perfect. Because you know what, I'm not sure. I think part of my, my aforementioned film degree, exposed me to some Western.
Listen, buddy.
Not to pull rank here or anything, but I definitely think
to pull rank.
But to pull rank real quick, just for this one point. No, I mean, not even. I do think that coming from a background, I took a course in Western, so that's kind of what I wanted to reference. But I definitely think that this movie is toying with values of the Western, and as much as I had fun trying to tie in some biblical themes into a lot of the components here. I mean, a lot of these concepts of the sort of like the old gunslinger that needs to come back to protect a city, the new sheriff that isn't trusted by everyone, and this sort of the town rallying together to stop this bandit, this crew of bandits that are, coming together at a very specific time to attack. And, all of that are things that, I personally have seen in a lot of these, these Western films. And it just, to me, felt like these themes, these ideas, and I agree with you with, what you were saying before about like the aftas and the coming together, the togetherness and standing up for, your fellow man that exists here, that certainly is Jewish. But I do think that the movie's presentation of those ideas is, Western thematically first before it gets to those Jewish ideas. And, as much as some of those Jewish themes are certainly, present, I actually think this movie's irreverence and humor and, the way that it sort of doesn't commit to teaching a lesson, but, before it can, it sort of jumps away to some other ridiculous, offhand joke. I think that, for me, just undercuts it a little bit and just makes us more of just like, like a parody than anything that I pulled such strong themes from. So, for this one, 2 stars, 1 star, really.
Oh my gosh. Wow. See, I'm going to double down. I feel like the Jewish humor of this movie is like in itself, like a Jewish value sort of. And like, there is no more Jewish humorist in terms of film, at least for this genre, for like slapstick satire, kind of over the top humor, and like than Mel Brooks. And so I feel like, this makes, so I don't know, I'm sticking by my 4 and you can stick by your 1 over there and we'll just be on separate sides of the room. And that's totally fine. I wouldn't, if I went to like a video store, I haven't been in a while, but maybe we should take a trip down memory lane and go to Scarecrow Video up here in Seattle and check it out. But I'm wondering, like, would Blazing Saddles be in the Western section? Would it be in the humor section? Would it be in the Jewish film section? I wonder. Like, it's a good question.
I would say that's the question that, we're trying to answer here.
Maybe we should call them up right now at 9:00 at night and say, hey, do you have Blazing Saddles on DVD?
Right, first of all, exactly.
And if so, what section is it in? So, yeah, I mean, I think, but I think that's that's the beauty of this podcast, right? Like agreeing to disagree. So knowing what we know about our ratings, overall Jewishness, what would you give this film 1 out of 5 stars for David?
I'm tempted to give it, just sort of a firm 3, because I definitely thought that, the movie, the plot, the sort of context was very Jewish, but obviously thematically, I didn't come out as strongly, but because I don't want it to be square in the middle. I do think this feels more Jewish than not. I'm going to go with, I think 3.5 Jewish stars.
3.5 Jewish stars. Okay, cool. I think, like you said, there's a lot about this movie that is Jewish, a lot of that movie that isn't Jewish. And so I feel like it's unfair to give it like 2.5 stars, which is kind of right in the middle. So I'm also thinking like 3 stars, something like that, 3.25 maybe, just to be different than you, because that's just how we roll.
Perfect. How it should be.
I think if you haven't seen this movie and you're listening to this podcast, what are you doing? You probably should have watched the movie at the beginning and paused it, but thanks for making it this far. But yeah, we'd be curious to know what you think. Hit us up on Instagram. We're at Jews on Film. That's our working title, or one of our working titles. I don't know. But yeah, let us know what you think. And did you want to talk about our book club section of the podcast? Before we do, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're here talking about Blazing Saddles, and we have a few sort of book recommendations or book club. I don't know what the hell we're calling this section. What do you think?
Yeah, book club. Jewish book club. Just throw Jewish in front of it and it works for the podcast.
Yeah, it could work to our detriment these days, but I don't know. A little dark, fair. But go ahead. What do you got?
Sure. So, this was a book that I thought of, from the moment you approached me about doing this podcast, and that sort of informed some of the way that I think about, what is considered a Jewish movie. It's called Kosher Movies. It's by Rabbi Herbert J. Cohen. And what's interesting about it is that, hearing the title, and when I show it to people, they hear kosher movies. And I think, the first impression is this must be, sort of like censored and, age appropriate movies that, you can show to kids, quote unquote, kosher, the way that a lot of people think of that word. But what's really interesting about it is that, first of all, it features, plenty of films that are at least rated PG-13. I want to say there's a couple in here that are rated R actually, but wild, I know. But what it does is it goes through a bunch of popular movies, and he calls it, the subtitle is, a film critic discovers life lessons at the cinema. And it sort of minds movies that I would say otherwise would not be considered Jewish. There's no obviously Jewish movies in here. And he pulls out, sort of life lessons that he thinks, themes that he thinks applies to, that are Jewish themes that, can be pulled from these movies. And, when we were talking about that theme section, as we continue to talk about, how Jewish are the themes of this movie, I definitely think that the framework of this book is sort of what I have in mind, because it takes a movie, that you might otherwise not consider to be a Jewish film. And it shows, there are Jewish themes and values in a lot of these movies. And I would say those absolutely are, Jewish films alongside some of the more obvious ones that, we mentioned at the top of the podcast. So it's just a cool way to think about, what is a Jewish movie, and definitely expanded the definition, which is going to be vital for this podcast, because I think eventually we would run out if we were sticking with, just sort of very explicitly Jewish movies. There's not so many of them.
Right. Definitely. I'm wondering, is Blazing Saddles in there?
I was flipping through it before we started, actually. I'm not sure if it is. I don't see it.
All right. Give me a heads up if you do find it. For my book recommendation, I'm going to go with this one called the Celebrity Kosher Cookbook. Can't really see because of the background on it here, but it's basically a cookbook I got from my grandparents' house. So they grew up, I grew up in LA, and so they had a lot of books on their bookshelves. One of which we'll save for another podcast, is a Marx Brothers book signed by all 4 Marx Brothers, which is pretty chill. And so we'll talk about that maybe, and I'll show it off at the maybe when we review a Marx Brothers movie down the line, hopefully in the not too distant future. But this is a book from 1975. So it's basically from a synagogue in Los Angeles, I think. And the book is by Marilyn Hall and Rabbi Jerome Cutler. It's just got a lot of celebrity recipes. We have, William Shatner, Soupy Sales, Ed Asner, Joan Rivers, Walter Matthau, Don Rickles, really a who's who of the golden age of Hollywood, I guess. And so we have Gene Wilder. We have a recipe from Gene Wilder. If you're interested, we could kind of go through that. We also have Sammy Davis Jr., Herb Alpert. I also feel like I saw Madeline Kahn, who plays Lili Von Shtup. So it was like a double feature of Blazing Saddle stars. But let me tell you what Gene Wilder suggested on page 144 of this book. This is a mock strudel. What that means, I'm not quite sure. But it's essentially a lot of butter, a lot of sugar, dates, jam, nuts, raisins, Turkish delight, and shredded sweetened coconut. So it sounds really good. And he tells a little bit of stories about growing up with his bubby and kind of, making this with her and stuff like that. But we could post the recipe up on Instagram and maybe we could try it out and see if it comes out okay. I feel like the proportions back then with baked goods was like heavy on the butter and heavy on the oil. And now it's like a little bit dialed back these days, but it's pretty cool to see that in addition to being really funny on screen, that he was also an excellent baker. I guess that wraps it up for this episode, right? Any closing thoughts?
Jewishness aside, however you think it fits sort of on the rankings, this is an amazing movie. I would definitely give it, a seal of approval. I think it's great.
Hear that, everyone? You got the hairy seal of approval. I don't know if you knew this, but he studied film criticism. So
this was not supposed to be my angle. I'm going to have to change my whole persona by the next pod.
That you're like this erudite film critic and I'm this sort of man of the people kind of reviewer.
Exactly. These are not the angles that we're taking. So tune in next week. You'll hear a totally different version of, who we are.
I like this. This sets up a good dynamic, sort of,
That's right. Maybe I'll turn it into a persona. But I just want the record to be clear. This will not be me. This will be the erudite, the persona that sells the podcast.
Sure. And you could do a heel turn, maybe like mid-season, where you actually become a good guy and I become the bad guy. And that's sort of my origin story. Exactly. Yeah, I feel like Harry said, great movie, really worth watching, especially maybe after listening to this podcast and having a little bit more context. And, I wouldn't watch it with like super young kids. I would say that like the older you are, the more you'll get out of it. And especially coming into it with some sort of context would really help. Yeah. If there's a film that you want us to check out, make sure to tag us and we'll check it out. Jews on Film is hosted and produced by Daniel Zana and Harry Ottensaucer. Daniel Zana edited this episode. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Jews on Film and subscribe to our podcast to get new episodes. Thanks for listening.